Welcome to EPG Pathshala. We are in the paper titled Methodology of Research in Sociology, and we are discussing the module titled Historical Method in Sociological Research. By mid-20th century, historical method began to emerge as an important method in sociological research. This emerged within the broad realm of the qualitative method in sociology. The historical method consists of using sources from the past mainly to reconstruct an event or happening. In this module, you will learn about the nature and use of the historical method for sociological research.
Sociology at its birth was practiced as what would today be called historical sociology. The writings of Auguste Comte, the one who brought into widespread use the term sociology, and Herbert Spencer were centered on the practice of history. Both Comte and Spencer, in their own way, were trying to make sense of large scale transformations in society and identify structures and processes that underlay the working of society by trying to evolve a scientific understanding of society as it changed over time using information about the past. By the late 19th century, the professionalization of the disciplines, the demands for more direct evidence, and much more resulted in a presumption gaining importance within sociology that studying live individuals in a suitably scientific manner would provide the required scientific insight into the working of society that sociologists hope to find. Gradually, what would broadly be known as quantitative method in sociology was evolving into its own. In contrast, there was the qualitative method that came to be more associated with names like Karl Marx and Max Weber. Both Marx and Weber practiced what would be today called historical sociology. However, they were very sensitive to the fact that history, as it was being practiced in the 19th century, was essentially a discipline that revelled in the historian's whimsy. What the historians was saying was history. You believed it to be correct at your own risk and responsibility. The best that historians from Germany could do was to restrict the craft of history and making it as close to being scientific as possible. Let us note the celebrated injunction from the German historian von Ranke, who in the mid-19th century was the royal historiographer in the Prussian court. History should be practiced as a scientific discipline. The historian should back up their conclusions with information from the archives, and it was important to first have a critical analysis of the sources. But neither von Ranke nor his equally celebrated students provided a textbook method of how this could be done. Under the circumstances, people like Marx, Weber, interested in more in the problems of contemporary times and delving into the past only in order to get an insight into their own specific contemporary problems, were focused to come up with their own strategies of systematization and being scientific. Marx's way of being more scientific involved taking a template of human behavior that was considered to be universally true, hence scientific. All history is a history of class struggle was the opening line of the Communist Manifesto, one of the earliest documents authored by Marx. The subsequent endeavor to understand history involved stretching and testing evidence about social and individual action against this template. Marx's much celebrated studies on the history of capitalism and the condition of industrial workers were significantly based on historical data from official archives. This data had been mostly generated by the authorities of the state and the church in order to facilitate the governance of their respective institutions. Bringing about revolutionary changes or empowering people was not the purpose of these efforts as data collection and maintenance. It was Marx's efforts to stretch the archival data over a revolutionary template that provided the basis of understanding the faults of 19th century society and the possibilities of bringing about changes in this society. Max Weber equally used historical method to write both history of medieval business organizations in 1889 and Roman agrarian history and its significance for public and private law in 1891. This, one could say, was Weber before Weberian sociology came into being. It was during these studies that Weber began to systematize the concepts on the basis of which society could be studied, adding to the body of systematization of concepts that would enable sociology to claim scientificity for itself. Within the broad realm of qualitative method in sociology came, by the mid 20th century, those inquiries in which the historical method was used more extensively. Many sociologists, whose practice varied considerably, have commented on how the sociological method was not entirely divorced from the historical. Anthony Giddens insisted that there was no logical or methodological reason to distinguish between the historical method and the more quantitative one. 2 decades earlier, C. Wright Mills had made a similar exhortation. Every social science requires an historical scope of conception and a full use of historical materials. It was not just sociologists who were exhorting researchers to make use of the historical method to obtain a superior insight into their research problems. Historians too would do the same in the other direction, ask historians to make use of sociological insights. Peter Bouquet was one such example who in his studies of cultural history was influenced enough by the sociological method and concepts that he argued for the need for social scientists to be skilled in both history as well as sociology. So long as historians and sociologists try to make sense of the society as a whole, there is no way in which one can ignore the other. If sociology is defined as a study of human society with an emphasis on generalizations about its structure and development, then history is defined as a study of human societies, placing the emphasis on the differences between them. Such exhortations about interlinking the historical and sociological method have continued over the years from the side of both historians and sociologists. Today, we might take for granted the importance and relevance of both the methods. Which method would be given primacy would depend on the manner in which the research questions have been framed and the kind of evidence available at hand. As the practice of history has evolved over the 20th century, it has become clear that historians are more interested in reconstructing events, understanding phenomena, and explaining process. Partly, this has to do with the nature of the source material which comes to us from the past. It is more scattered, less systematized, and cannot necessarily be molded to suit the questions under research. It is not so much the questions that determine the nature of the evidence to be collected, rather, questions in historical research often get framed on the basis of the material available for research. What is the reason for using the historical method to understand sociological questions? It is because social structures are not standalone entities and events of the past influence the way the present is structured. If happenings of the past influence contemporary structures, processes, and interactions, then the historical method is an important way of uncovering the past. If society is a multi-layered entity, then historical inquiry sensitizes us to the fact of uniqueness of some layers of a society and their changeability with time and context. The need to use the historical method also arises because society is not a timeless entity. It changes according to the specific place and time in which it is located. The manner in which people exist, their combining to form associations, groups, and even larger entities like nations change significantly over time. Moreover, even contemporary societies, the ones that sociologists study, do not exist on a standalone basis. They stand in a larger stream of history. Their contemporary existence itself is being influenced in significant ways by the larger process of history of which they are part. Hence, it is important to be sensitive to the historical process within which society is placed, able to examine the changes occurring over time. As Charles Tilly, the American sociologist who conducted a number of historical inquiries, noticed that historical inquiry sensitizes us to the fact that boundaries of social units are porous, structures keep changing, sequences never quite repeat themselves. What happened before affects the character of the next structure, sequence of process. Something akin to this was experienced when insights from America were sought to be imposed on third world societies in the aftermath of the Second World War. In the case of India, in the early decades of independence, the efforts at development produced positive results only till such time that the agencies sponsoring them continued to care for them. More often than not, the infrastructure and tools that would have brought about development in local society were simply allowed to rot away the moment they were handed over to local society. It also seemed as if the people were not interested in the development that was being sponsored by Western sources. It was only after much time and money had been wasted that a realization set in amongst those sponsoring development that it might be a good idea to be able to make schemes that fulfill the felt needs of the local people rather than the needs that the sponsors had presumed to exist. It would take still more time before the idea took hold that important to any sponsored development was an effort to co-opt the people who were to be subjected to the development process. To take another example, in which the use of the historical method enabled the researchers to come up with a richer explanation. It is the case of terrorist violence in Punjab in the 1980s and 90s. So long as those trying to understand that violence remained insensitive to history, they continued to focus on economic troubles of Punjab, the decline in the profitability of agriculture as the main cause for violence. The problem, of course, was that this argument about decline in the economy of Punjab was being made at a time when Punjab was one of the most prosperous states in India. However, other regions facing greater economic hardships did not seem to be fostering terrorism. It was those researchers who went into the history of Punjab who noticed that terrorist violence was linked to a peculiar sense of dignity, linked with the use of violence that had been fostered by the mix of religion and politics in Punjab. Subsequently, one of the most influential sociological studies based on interviews with terrorists used such historical insights to notice how the failure of the state in Punjab had allowed for an opportunity for some young men to use the excuse of religion to pick up the gun and demand from local society dignity for themselves and their families. Earlier, in the case of Punjab, a similar effort at reclaiming dignity for themselves had been noticed by Paramjit Judge in the Naxal movement that had emerged in Punjab since the late 1960s. By a detailed historical reconstruction of the events in which the Naxals were involved, Judge was able to show the interlinkage between the issues of dignity and ideologically driven violence in Punjab. A similar use of history was made in the writings of Ronki Ram, wherein the assertions by those of the lower castes were traced through history to show how the battle for caste equality was not just about gaining economic status but also about reconstructing a new culture and a new history for those who felt robbed and cheated by the system of caste hierarchies. It was the detailed investigations into the history of the movement that enabled Ronki Ram to go beyond issues of caste exploitations and process of sanitization that had often been noticed by others studying the same process. Important in both cases, that of the studies done by Paramjit Judge and Ronki Ram, was the effort to recreate the events surrounding the subject of study much as would be done by a historian. Such detailed reconstructions of the past help understand the antiquity or absence of it for many of the social phenomena that one might observe in fieldwork and as being important in contemporary times. What happens if researchers ignore historical method? It results in lopsided explanations which might give impression that society is unchanging and phenomena observed currently are incorrectly presumed to be rooted in history even when none such exists. Then let's look at what is the historical method. There is no single definition of what the historical method consists of, but broadly speaking, the practice of historians in examining changes in society over time is what constitutes the historical method. Historians usually are more interested in happenings, events, and process than on more sharply defined research problems that usually interest sociologists. If there is no single definition, then correspondingly there is no single way of doing history either. In significant ways, inquiries into history depend on the questions asked as also on the availability of material to help the investigation. There are two types of historical sources, one primary and two secondary. Sources that are close to the happenings are termed as primary sources, and those that are at a distance from the happenings are classified as secondary sources. Historians prefer to consider primary sources as more reliable for reconstructing the past. Two large categories of sources for history are primary sources, which are close to the events under study, and secondary sources, which are removed away from the events under study. Secondary sources include monographs published by scholars, theses, journal articles, etc. Primary sources are the more important for pursuing historical inquiry. You may find different kinds of primary sources that are available to the researcher. Do note that initially historians almost exclusively focused on government documents, autobiographies, and memoirs as primary sources, but later a more imaginative use of sources became possible, and the number of sources that could possibly use for historical research has increased manifold. The list presented here does not preclude the use of some newer kinds of sources that have remained below the radar of historical inquiry. Let us look at each of these. Written sources. There is no exclusive list of sources on the basis of which the past can be interpreted. The practice of historians suggests that historians extensively use written records, whether in the form of official files, published and unpublished reports and files, censuses, records with various institutions, private papers, diaries, contemporary newspapers and journals, published and unpublished tracts, books, and pamphlets produced during the events under investigation. Virtually every institution or business leaves behind a paper trail. Those papers are the grist to the historian's mill. Those papers, whether published or not, are the ones that become primary sources for the historical inquiry. Importance of knowing languages. To say that research requires knowledge of languages would be to state the obvious. However, when using the historical method, language knowledge is even more important. In the specific case of India, using the historical method often means also being able to work comfortably with multiple languages other than English, since often primary sources are available in local languages and not in English. One recent example of a rather competent use of primary sources is in the reconstruction of the socio-economic microhistory of the Chamars using extremely localized information from published and unpublished tracts. Here, COT documents in detail the history of weaving in the Chamar community, which is otherwise associated only with leather work till its virtual disappearance in the 1990s. Badri Narayan, in his documentation of the extensive use of local language tracts in which the concerns of the lower caste people are expressed, notes the significance of being able to engage with local language publishing in order to make sense of the changing concerns of lower caste people. It is also possible to construct the local history of the subject under investigation using primarily English language sources along with the judicious use of the interview technique. Apart from written sources, there are also unwritten sources. It is possible for a researcher to reconstruct the past using information gathered through interviews. Historians too have made use of unwritten records as a source to understand the past. Once again, there is no exclusive list of such sources. The practice of historians suggests that unwritten records that have been used include oral testimonies, interviews, oral evidence in the form of recordings from the past, as in recordings of music, speeches, etc., pictorial evidence, as in photos, illustrations, paintings, etc., folk songs, and folk memories. Currently, many of the important repositories of historical research conduct and preserve interviews with people whom they consider important for purposes of history. Archives. The use of archives in social research is not a method of research, it is merely the use of yet another resource for getting an understanding. Historians specialize in using archives. They use them to inspect social, institutional, and personal memories. Those memories then are often recrafted to form an understanding of something that is bothering contemporary society. Sometimes an inquiry into the archives is also to find an insight into the society in days gone by. Whatever may be the motive for accessing the archives, using archives is about accessing memories of places, people, things, institutions, social formations, etc. from a time gone by. Memories, especially those held contemporaneously, have a funny way of seeming to have considerable permanence even when they are completely over time. For one who is involved in social research, examining the archives could also be a device to benchmark the subject under study through time. Many of the written and unwritten records are stored in archives. Many institutions maintain active archives. Business houses, banks, governments retain archives. Often these are available for consultation by researchers. In India, most of the active archives are linked to the Indian Historical Records Commission that is headquartered at the National Archives of India. A specific query sent by email to the National Archives of India usually results in accurate guidance on where specific archives are located. A search through secondary literature generated by historians contains adequate guidance as to the availability of archival sources. Some records, such as land records, are available for consultation with village level revenue officials. Similarly, judicial records remain stored with the concerned court. Police thanas retain their case diaries and other records in perpetuity. Such records are not archived in the sense of being brought to the central repository such as the State or National Archives of India. Just as it is important to understand the numbering system of a library in order to retrieve a book from the library, so in archives. It is important to understand the system of cataloging records and archiving information. That information varies from archive to archive. Even a rudimentary knowledge of the archiving and cataloging strategies of an archive helps speed up research considerably. The help desk staff of the archives usually are more than willing to assist all researchers in this regard. Historical records in archives are prized documents. Access to them is usually restricted to bona fide researchers. Therefore, before visiting an archive, it is important to check out the specific terms and conditions that lay for allowing their holdings to be consulted. What are the analytical tools used for the historical method? The historical method relies very heavily on the written word. Correspondingly, there has been pressure to be more sensitive to the use of language and the meanings underlying words. Prior to the postmodernist turn in history, that is before the 1980s in India, there was no specific injunction to be careful about the use of language. However, since 1980s, there has been greater emphasis on usages and meanings of words and their being heavily context dependent and ever changingness. Historians of the 1960s vintage also insisted on making a distinction between the historical fact and the fact that has no historical importance. However, today it is understood that this is a false distinction and what fact is of value for understanding the past is dependent on the manner in which questions are posed and answers sought. Here are the list of examples of the use of historical method. Then let's look at the limitations of the historical method. History is an interpretational exercise that does not exist before it is written. Even whilst it influences contemporary events, happenings and process, it is not as if history is an artifact from the past waiting outside of the research field, waiting for being picked up, unearthed and brought to light. It is unlike a piece of pottery or a cave painting waiting to be discovered. It is what the researcher makes of it. For any period beyond living memory, the material left behind by the past will be physical evidence, and from it a pattern of events is constructed which it is contended actually happened. Historians insist that their reconstruction is fair even if the evidence base is fairly small. Generalizing out of one or at most a handful of examples might provide insights, but those insights need to be tested out more thoroughly. A single instance does not necessarily indicate a trend. The same logic works as a check on extra enthusiasm for insights provided by historical research. They are just that, insights. In fact, historians are currently bound to say that all historical insights that are subject to qualifications, change, and modifications. Historical research does not claim to be representing any big truth about the subject under investigation.
To conclude, by the end of this module, we have acquired a familiarity about what is historical method and how it helps a sociological understanding of society. We have seen some of the debates over the use of the historical method and its value in helping strengthen sociological research. We have also become acquainted with some of the resources like archives, etc., used by historians and sociologists when they do a historical investigation into society.